Hi, I'm Clarissa Moll, producer and moderator of the Bulletin. Here's a short clip from one of our segments in this week's episode. To hear the whole conversation, visit the link in our show notes or search for The Bulletin on your favorite podcast platform. Bad guys in the Big Apple have been busy this week. The Broadway musical turned movie Wicked, about the misunderstood and misrepresented Wicked Witch of the West, made box office history as the first musical to reach $300 million worth of sales. And on the darker side, Daniel Penny, accused of killing a man on the New York subway, walked away free, while 26-year-old Luigi Mangione headed to jail after a 5-day manhunt for the suspected murder of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. The central premise of Wicked is this idea: are people born wicked, or do they have wickedness thrust upon them? And it's been fascinating to see this movie plot line play out across the news commentary on these stories this week. Joining us to talk about this is a woman I encountered for the first time on a much smaller screen in my church basement years ago when I gathered for a Bible study on the book of Daniel. She's a dynamic teacher, a best-selling author, and the founder and visionary of Living Proof Ministries. Beth Moore, welcome to the Bulletin.
So happy to be here, Clarissa. I am trying to picture that in the basement. I can just imagine. I'm so happy to have served you.
Well, thank you. When it comes to these headlines, that central question of wicked has been applied over and over. Were these men inherently wicked, or did the situation in which they found themselves compel them to wickedness? And so I want to ask you, as that young mom who sat in a Bible study years ago, and as we look at these headlines today, is this a fair question, or is it a false dichotomy? Are we actually wicked, or is wickedness thrust upon us?
Well, we know from Scripture, I'm thinking off the top of my head of Psalm 51, "In sin my mother conceived me." In other words, we're born into it by nature. You know, we use the word wicked. What Ephesians would still call it, even in the very beginning of Ephesians chapter 2, is that we have all been children of wrath. I mean, that is a strong, strong word. So we would, biblically speaking, very much believe that we were born with a very sinful nature. Yes. Now, can circumstances take that and make it something that becomes overwhelming to us and turn us into something that we might never have otherwise been? That's another matter, and for much greater discussion.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the case of Luigi Mangione, folks have responded very powerfully to the story of the manhunt, to discovering him to be the sort of alleged killer. For example, while some were condemning him as a cold-blooded killer, others have been flooding the Macy's website to buy his look-alike Levi's jacket and lauding him as a folk hero. And it appears, while there is clarity mounting that he might be the one, people are really struggling with seeing this young man as wicked. Why do you think, Beth, that so many people respond viscerally to a complicated story like this and try to make it simpler, perhaps, than it actually is?
Right. I think right now it would be hard to sever it from what our culture is like in the politicization of absolutely everything. So I have a hard time trusting, because of this present climate socially, I'd have trouble trusting that it is of anything of the heart of what would be normal rational judgment. There might be side-taking otherwise, but I'm talking about the kind of side-taking we're seeing right now. I do think probably has more to do with sides, like this would be the side, this would be the take my side would have on this, and then this would be the take my side would have on this. And so I don't trust that that's coming from just that natural part of us that would look at it and see how we would respond to it. I think that it is very much a part of this present mood that we're in. it's hard to tell where that line would be, but I just think right now everything is so charged, enough to have us in a state of where we have lost our reasoning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Russell, it sounds like a sort of superficiality in moral evaluation.
Yeah, it's these different moral questions are turned into avatars of who's my tribe and what does that mean. I also think that there's a line here. I mean, so you think about the way the Bible talks about us as both created and fallen. There's something about, if you think about kind of the pop culture version of it, the Wicked movie, and before that, to John Gardner's Grendel, and other things that would take villains and put them in the protagonist role to show kind of this is how that person developed into this. There's something about that is, I think, embedded in the way God made us to see even villains created in the image of God. But there's another part of it that I think is sort of cynical and self-justifying when it becomes this attitude that, well, we're all just as wicked as we can possibly be. We're just pretending in various ways. So you can't expect anything other than just the most base motives in people, which then gives me the justification to, I've got to be just as wicked as the next person if I'm going to survive. I mean, that's a mindset you see in so many different aspects of American life right now. I saw it the other day. I hadn't read this story in years, but Jorge Luis Borges has this short story that is disturbing. I find it blasphemous, and I was horrified by it when I first read it. But he does a short story where the incarnation, where what is revealed is that the incarnation, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, but not as Jesus, as Judas. And the point of the story is, if God really were to be with us and to take our nature, it would be Judas, because that's all that you can expect from human beings is just evil. And I think that's a particularly disturbing, shocking sort of presentation of it, but it's a mindset that I think a lot of people have, and a lot of people have in the Christian world, strangely enough.
It's interesting. I see it a little different. I mean, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but I think the other way to think about it is that, I mean, Wicked in particular is such a product of a therapeutic culture, right? And I think the dangerous message of Wicked is, and look, I liked the movie. You know, I took my daughters, they're musical theater kids, like they loved it. We went and saw it. It was great. But there is this element of the story that basically says, you know, once you understand somebody's origin story, you realize that they're actually a victim that the evil that they do is a result of their victim status in some form. And Slavoj Žižek, this kind of insane philosopher that I've followed for many years, he's very interesting, he's very provocative. But he has this great rant that he does on a pretty regular basis where he says, you know, actually, a direct quote of his is, "I'm ready to shoot people who claim that an enemy is a person whose inner story we don't know yet." Right? And what he says is, you know, you see this, it's like a bumper sticker. You know, your enemy is just somebody who you don't understand. And he says, look at the great criminals of history, Hitler, Stalin, whoever. Do we really think that the problem for these people was that Hitler didn't get into art school? Do we really think that the problem is that we just don't understand where they're coming from? And if we just really understood their deepest inner selves? And this is where, like I said, this is where my take is a little different, because I think the deeper truth, and Zizek gets at this, the deeper truth is we are depraved, right? Like we are at our core, at our inmost being, like we're creatures who are fallen and prone to sin. And the challenge then, the question then becomes, what do we do about our agency? And I think there's an aspect of these narratives, whether it's about the shooter, whether it's about Wicked, it robs people of agency because it says, well, they do these evil things because of what's happened to them, because of where they've come from, rather than saying, I don't care where you came from. You don't shoot somebody, because you're unhappy with your healthcare coverage. That's evil. That is wrong. Like there's a moral line. There are lines we do not cross in civil society, and that seems to be lost a bit in this conversation. And I do think, Clarissa, I think you're smart to connect these two stories, because I do think there is a thread, kind of a therapeutic psychological thread that connects them.
Listen to the full episode wherever podcasts are found.